One wrong move with your Terraform state file and it could destroy your entire infrastructure. I've read actual cases where teams lost their tfstate file and suddenly had no way to manage their cloud resources. In this video, I'm going to walk you through 6 things you should always take note of when dealing with your Terraform state file so that you can keep your infrastructure safe and under control. So I will explain what a state file is. A state file in Terraform is a JSON document that keeps track of the Terraform configuration and maps it to real-world infrastructure. So we have this here. Let this be our Terraform main file. So this state, everything here, your API gateway lambda S3, is defined in this main Terraform configuration, this main Terraform file. So when this is deployed here, Terraform is going to keep a record of all of it in here. That's basically what the state file is, so that I can track it. So whatever changes is made here, let's say we remove this SQSQ for some reason on S3 buckets, remove that here, and Terraform removes that here. Those changes are going to be marked here as well. For instance, here the S3 bucket is going to be tracked here. It's going to be removed from here because it's no longer managed by Terraform, or because it's deleted. So that's why the state file is so important, and that's why it must be managed carefully. Because if we lose this state file, this entire configuration is to be live and available, but it will no longer be managed by Terraform. So you could have this entire thing still here, but if you make any changes here, it will assume that there is nothing because we don't have a state file containing this live infrastructure. So that's why we must keep this safe so that we can always have it and ensure that the entire configuration is managed by Terraform. So now let's move to the thing that we must always do to make sure this is safe. The first thing, I think this is common amongst beginners when using Terraform at first, using local state for a team project. If you're using if it's just you working on a personal project, then I believe this is fine. But when you bring in a team member, let me get a copy of the state file. Great. Each change this user makes is going to be tracked by the state file. We've established that. But one thing we need to take into that only this user can have access to this state file because it's stored locally, unless you have some form of network configuration rigged up where it's stored on a shared drive. But if that's the case, you might as well use something called a local backend for that. That's where you use something like an S3 bucket. Just get this here. S3. Then you store your state file in here. Well, before then, let me check exactly what I mean by this. You have a second user. This second user would not have access to the state file because it's stored locally. But when you introduce this as such, then we can ensure that both users have access to this state file. This is extremely important in teams so that you can ensure that both will have access to it. This is similar to how it will be when we don't have a state file here, because the user wants to make changes to the infrastructure where they don't have a state file. So it's as if that no infrastructure is made. So that could cause serious conflicts. So that's why this is also important. I must say it's also important in CI/CD pipelines, because let's say you have a GitHub Actions CI/CD pipeline. GitHub Actions wants to deploy to Terraform. It needs access to that state file, because if it doesn't, it's going to recreate new environment and your internet CI/CD pipeline runs, and we can't have that. So that's why this is so important to manage. So next thing, not using state locking. This is a natural progression from that example, because we have a user, and just grab this. We have this. So they make changes to our Terraform configuration. When each person makes this change, it's going to modify the state file. Great. So what happens when user 1 is making a change, then user 2 comes along and makes a different change entirely? There could be conflicts. So this could cause many things could happen. Like the state file could become corrupted, losing everything, and you could also create conflict within the environment. So this, so that's why there's something called state locking in Terraform. With state locking, when one user makes changes to the Terraform configuration is being applied, this Terraform state file is locked, meaning that this will not be able to have access to it. It's going to throw an error. So with S3, use DynamoDB. DynamoDB enables state locking for S3 buckets. But in recent version of Terraform, you can just use S3 alone without your DynamoDB table. What next, actually? Yeah. Well, let's say an instance happened where you're in a CI/CD pipeline now and the CI fails. Sometimes the state file remain locked. So you can simply use Terraform force unlock to do that. Terraform will provide the lock ID and use that to unlock the state file forcefully. The next thing is committing your state file to your repo. There's something about Terraform state files. It stores sensitive values in the state file. So your passwords could be there, everything just in plain text, not encrypted. So this is why you need to ensure that your Terraform state file is nowhere near your GitHub repo. You're supposed to add it to your gitignore file. There are a couple other things you need to add as well to your Terraform gitignore file. You have your .tfstate and everything under it. So just add this, change it to code. Next, you have your .terraform. Everything over after it should never be committed. Just have your tf file. Oops. Even if your GitHub repo is private, this should never be committed. So the next thing is not encrypting your state file. This is a natural progression of the other because of, recall I said that the values in the state file are in plain text and not encrypted. So you need to ensure that anyone who has access to that state file cannot simply just see it. It needs to be encrypted. Like with S3, you can enable an S3 encryption with it. You should also ensure that not just anyone has access to that state file. You can do that with bucket policies. Because unauthorized persons, or let's say you have multiple buckets, for instance, one for dev, staging, and prod. You don't want someone in the dev team that's handling the dev environment to have access to the previous ones, sorry, to the other one, just for security, and this ensures the principle of least privilege. So let's go on. Not backing up your state file. There's one thing about this. I've heard of teams that launched their state file, but they made backups. So with the backups they could easily recover everything. This is important because we can't really control everything, and sometimes things may happen and we lose it, or something may happen here. But once you create backup for your state file, perfect. For S3, we could use versioning. Next thing is not separating state files per environment. So let me quickly expand this. So each of this is going to have a state file. We'll call this, let's call this dev staging and prod. So each of them is going to have just suppose that separate state file. But let's give an instance where all of them share the same state file. Oops. Here, dev, you deploy some things, state file here. Staging is going to overwrite whatever is written by the dev environment here. So the entire dev infrastructure is lost because the staging is going to have different values than the dev environment, different tags. Whatever is different from the dev is going to be overwritten by the staging, by the current environment. Same thing with the prod. When you now go to prod, your prod is going to have its own different tags, different secrets, everything, and overwrites whatever was there for the staging. Then you come back to the dev and you make changes here. It's going to completely mess up the entire infrastructure because everything's jumbled up, is messed up. So that's why you have to separate it. Just like you have a dev staging environment, dev staging and prod environment separated, you also have your respective state file separated. So now, changes made to the dev environment will have no effect to the staging and no effect to the prod. This is how it's meant to be. Separate environments, separate concerns. Then the final thing is manually editing your state file. Your state file, under no circumstances, should it be manually edited. Don't go into your state file and start manually editing there and thinking it's going to change your infra exactly how you want. It might work, but other is going to get messed up. So in order to do that, you're supposed to either make the changes within your infrastructure code, that's your Terraform main.tf file, or if you want to remove something that you no longer want Terraform to manage it, then use Terraform state to remove. That's Terraform state RM. Then the module or the resource that's used. Then use Terraform state RM to remove it so that the deployed resource is going to still be there, but it's simply not going to be managed by Terraform any longer. Same thing as if you want to add something to your Terraform state file, use Terraform import to do that. So you have an EC2 instance running and it's not managed by you. So you simply use Terraform imports to bring that EC2 instance under your control using Terraform. So that's great. That works perfectly. And I still really recommend that as a last minute thing. But otherwise, you could just, or if you want the infrastructure, if you want the infrastructure to remain there, then you're going to use your Terraform state RM to do that. But if you want to delete the entire resource, you could simply comment out the code in your infrastructure as code, that's your main.tf file, or you could just remove it if you want. But to do that, you have to ensure that your entire Terraform project is version controlled so that it can track the changes and all those things. I'm probably going to do a video on that, the importance of tracking your Terraform configuration using Git. So that's that for this video. Thank you for watching, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one.